Do you know the feeling when you've been trying to solve one mystery for your entire life? Nope? Well, Detective Anderson does. During almost 30 years of working for the police, he solved many riddles, caught hundreds of robbers, and helped save thousands of lives. There's a huge number of successfully solved cases on his record. At the age of 25, he caught a thief who changed his own face with plastic surgery once a year. When Anderson was 30, prisoners started breaking from jails all over the world. The detective successfully solved this case. At the age of 38, he discovered the secret base of a forbidden order in a volcano's mouth. By his 50s, he managed to explain all the most inexplicable things in the world. But there was something he couldn't solve. These were two mysteries from the 50s, cases of missing planes. All these years, Anderson has been scrolling through the details of this puzzle. Unfortunately, he was too young when this story began. All he had were guesses and notes. But today, a sudden thought struck him. For the first time in many years, he felt that he could finally solve this mystery. But to do this, he had to immerse himself in this story again. So he opened the closet and pulled out two old magazines with detailed articles about these incidents. The first one happened in the summer of 1955. July 1st, Pan Am Flight 914 was about to depart from New York Airport with 61 people on board. The plane model was a Douglas DC-4. It differed from modern aircraft, having giant propellers instead of turbines. So, all passengers fastened their seatbelts. The plane started taxiing down the runway, sped up, and took off. It went high into the sky and out of sight. Its destination was Florida. The flight time would be 3 hours. Dispatching services were watching the plane on their radar when suddenly, Pan Am 914 disappeared. The operator tried to contact the pilot but received no response. New York reported this to Florida. They said they couldn't see the plane either. Usually, pilots notify via radio if a plane crashes or gets into a storm. But this time, just nothing. After several unsuccessful attempts to establish the connection, they deployed large-scale search operations. Communication with the plane was interrupted when it was flying over the Atlantic Ocean. Therefore, the air company had to admit the aircraft crashed into the water. But this version had no proof. When planes fall that way, rescuers find floating debris. Some parts of the cabin or luggage always get to the surface. This time, rescuers found nothing. The plane didn't transmit any distress signals and didn't leave any traces of the crash. It seemed like it just disappeared into thin air. People forgot about this disaster for 37 years. And then, something bizarre happened. 1992, Venezuela, Caracas Airport. The control tower received a signal about an unknown aircraft approaching them. It was weird because it wasn't supposed to be there. There were no flights scheduled for that time. The plane was landing. The dispatcher and the rest of the airport staff understood that something was wrong here. The plane looked old, with huge propellers instead of turbines. After landing, the pilot contacted the airport.
Where are we?
The dispatcher asked him to identify himself. A few seconds later, he received an answer.
We are Pan Am Flight 914 departed from New York to Florida with a crew of 4 people and 57 passengers on board.
The dispatcher didn't know what to do next. He and the airport staff understood what kind of plane they were looking at. What was this plane doing 37 years later and almost 1,240 miles away from its destination? After a few seconds, the startled dispatcher turned on the microphone and said,
It is September 9th, 1992. You know that?
A long pause followed. Then, the pilot responded in a panic.
Oh no. Jimmy, where are we? No! Stay away! Let's go now!
The airport staff saw the pilot waving his hands in horror through the glass. Then, he started the engines and took the plane to the runway. Pan Am 914 increased its speed and took off. The dispatcher tried to stop him, but the pilot didn't respond. The plane disappeared into the sky, and no one else had heard of it since that day. Detective Anderson finished reading the article. He frowned and looked out the window. Raindrops were hitting the glass. The storm outside perfectly depicted what was happening in his mind at that moment. He seemed to know what had happened to that plane. All the clues were there, lying right in front of his eyes. But to know for sure, Anderson had to move on to the next case. It was another article, dated 1989. It happened in 1954. Santiago Airlines Flight 513 took off from West Germany Airport. The plane was due to land in Brazil in 18 hours. There were 88 passengers and 4 crew members on board. The plane hid behind the clouds and disappeared from all radar. Air traffic controllers were trying to contact the pilots, but didn't receive a response. 18 hours later, they called the airport in Brazil. Those dispatchers couldn't confirm this plane's landing and couldn't contact the pilots either. The search operation lasted for several months, but they found nothing. Just like in the Pan Am 914 case, the plane disappeared from radar while flying over the Atlantic Ocean. 2 years later, the search operation ended, and Santiago Airlines ceased its activities. October 12, 1989. Airport controllers in Brazil noticed a passenger plane that suddenly appeared on their radar. It didn't answer the airport staff's questions and just circled over the airbase. After a few minutes, the plane landed and nothing. No one opened the ramp. Passengers didn't get out. Pilots didn't respond. The aircraft was in perfect condition. One of the dispatchers realized that this was the missing Santiago Airlines Flight 513 that had been considered lost for 35 years. Airport staff approached the plane and opened the doors. What they saw there terrified them. The police, customs staff, doctors, detectives, and other airport staff members gathered around the plane. No one knew what to do next. There was no living person on board who could tell the truth. The plane disappeared in 1954 and appeared 35 years later in perfect condition without any damage. So far, no one has figured out what happened. Detective Anderson noticed the stories were very similar. Pan Am 914 disappeared in 1955. Santiago Airlines 513 vanished in 1954. The difference was almost a year. Anderson scratched his head and noticed another little detail. Both planes went missing from the radar the moment they were flying over the Atlantic Ocean. There are many myths about phantom ships and mysterious phenomena connected with the Bermuda Triangle. Detective Anderson knew these tales, but these 2 missing planes puzzled him. He looked at 2 articles and understood everything. Exactly! The solution was there, right in front of his eyes. Both stories were written in the same newspaper. There was no real dispatcher who communicated with the planes. Nothing was known about the passengers. No newspapers except this one published news about these missing aircraft. It seemed they just took the same story and changed the dates, locations, and names of flights. Yes, the case was solved. It was all fake. The rain stopped. Detective Anderson looked out the window and heard the sound of a passing train. He remembered another weird and fake story. A story about a phantom train. It took place in Italy in 1911. 100 passengers boarded the train of the Zanetti Railway Company. It went through the picturesque mountainous area, got into a mountain tunnel, and disappeared. No one else had seen the train since then. All the passengers were lost, but not for long. They appeared in the past. There were records dated 1845. One unknown doctor from Mexico City wrote about 100 Italians who appeared in the city from nowhere. They were all dressed strangely and talked about one mysterious train. This was a completely made-up story. There was no proof or records about this train and the people who got into the past. A loud sound interrupted his thoughts. Detective Anderson picked up the phone. He was silently listening to the person on the other end of the line. A minute later, he answered, "Yes." The detective put the phone down. It was a new mystery for him. In the Sahara Desert, the locals noticed a huge ship lost in the South Pacific 27 years ago. There was no crew on board, no cargo, and no flags. No one knew how it appeared among the sand, but wet mud formed around it because of moisture. It seemed like the ship had just teleported there from the water. Perfect! No fakes this time. Detective Anderson put on his hat and left the office. But this story is for another video.
The plane had been in the air for a mere 25 seconds when the pilots noticed weird noises and bizarre vibrations. They tried several ways to improve the situation, but nothing worked. The engine surges continued, and just over a minute into the flight, when the plane reached 3,000 feet, both engines failed. First the right one, 2 seconds later the left one. The pilots decided to return to the airport they had just left. At the same time, they tried to restart the engines. Nothing seemed to work. The flight crew made a decision to pitch the plane down and then level it off. Perhaps it could help them gain some speed for the glide. But soon, they realized they wouldn't make it to the airport. Was the plane going to crash? That's when the miracle at Gotrura occurred. The morning before the flight started as usual. Regular pre-flight procedures, good weather. The members of the flight crew were experienced pilots. A 44-year-old Danish captain with over 8,000 flight hours under his belt, and a 34-year-old first officer from Sweden with 3,000 hours. So, what could go wrong? The plane itself was almost brand new. It was a McDonnell Douglas MD-81 nicknamed Dana Viking. It made its first flight on March 16, 1991. By that fateful day, the aircraft had been in service for a mere 9 months. There were 122 passengers and 7 crew members on board. Flight 751 Scandinavian Airlines was a scheduled flight from Stockholm, Sweden to Warsaw, Poland. On the way, the plane was supposed to make a stop in Copenhagen, Denmark. The aircraft took off from Stockholm according to its schedule at 8:47 a.m. local time. But by that point, the people inside had already been doomed, all because of a terrible sequence of events before the departure. It started the night before. The plane arrived at Stockholm Airport after a flight from Zurich. It was 10:09 p.m. The aircraft spent the night at the gate outside. It was cold. The temperatures dropped to 34 degrees Fahrenheit, just above freezing. What made the situation even worse was that almost 6,000 pounds of freezing cold fuel, chilled during the night, still remained in the tanks located in the wings. The fuel was so cold because the plane had been flying at the cruising altitude, where the air temperature outside the cabin varied from -61 to -80 degrees. The flight from Zurich lasted around 1 hour and 40 minutes. Soon after midnight, a flight technician came to check on the aircraft. The man had to remove some slush from the landing gear, otherwise he wouldn't be able to examine it. At around 2 a.m., when he was leaving, he noticed some ice covering the upper part of the wings. By the morning, the situation had become even dire. A layer of clear, almost invisible ice had formed on the tops of the wings. The plane had to leave the gate at around 8:30 a.m. An hour before the departure, the mechanic responsible for the plane noticed that some ice covered the underside of the wings. He decided to make sure there was no ice on the tops of the wings. He climbed a ladder and put one knee on the wing. Then he bent forward to touch the front part of the wing. There was no ice, just some slush. The mechanic decided to make sure everything was fine with the air inlet of one of the engines. He didn't find anything abnormal. Soon after that, the personnel used more than 220 gallons of de-icing fuel to remove ice from the plane. The mechanic consulted with the captain of the aircraft and ordered the staff to de-ice the underside of the wings as well. After all, he had seen some ice there. But no one thought to double-check if there was clear ice on the tops of the wings. After they had finished the procedure, the mechanic reported to the captain, "We're done here. De-icing finished. There was a lot of snow and ice, but everything's clear now." The captain thanked the mechanic and carried on with the pre-flight procedures. The plane taxied to the runway. Its engine's anti-ice systems were switched on and didn't show any malfunction. But several passengers later claimed they had seen ice sliding off the upper side of the wings while the plane had been taking off. And still, the plane left the ground and headed for Stockholm as usual. But shortly after the takeoff, several pieces of the overlooked ice broke off. At full speed, they slammed into the fans of the engines near the tail on both sides of the plane, ruining the blades. It led to a series of surges, and the rest is history. Meanwhile, somewhere in the cabin, Scandinavian Airlines flight captain Per Holmberg, who was on board as a passenger, noticed something was amiss. At first, he informed the flight attendant sitting in the rear jump seat that the right engine was surging. She tried to contact the flight crew, unsuccessfully. Then, the ununiformed captain rushed to the cockpit and asked if he could help the pilots. The first officer gave him the emergency checklist, and the captain asked him to start the auxiliary power unit, a small gas turbine in the tail of the plane. Holmberg's advice and help were invaluable, but was it enough to save the plane and the people inside? When the plane emerged from the cloud cover at an altitude of 890 feet, the pilots realized they wouldn't have enough time to make it back to the airport. An immediate emergency landing was unavoidable. The assisting captain passed the order to the cabin crew, and they started preparing the passengers. There was a large field to the north of the plane, but the captain realized they didn't have enough time to reach it. So he chose a much smaller field in a forested area in the direction of flight. It was not far from the village of Gotrura in Uppland, Sweden. The plane was just 1,300 feet above the ground when the assisting captain started extending the flaps. At a height of 183 feet, the captain reported to Stockholm Control, "We're crashing to the ground." 7 seconds later, the plane hit several trees and lost a huge chunk of its right wing. By that time, the landing gear had already been extended and the speed had decreased to 139 miles per hour. Moments later, the plane's tail struck the ground and broke off. The aircraft kept sliding across the field, still at high speed. It traveled 360 feet, with its main landing gear leaving marks on the field. At one point, the plane lost the main and nose landing gear. Its fuselage broke into 3 parts. Miraculously, there was no fire. If you look at the pictures from the crash site, the plane torn into pieces with its parts scattered across the field, it's hard to believe that all 129 people on board the plane survived. It seems like a miracle, but it was also thanks to the flight attendants' quick reaction and the correct instructions they gave the passengers. They didn't panic and told the people to adopt the brace position just in time to avoid fatalities. Even more surprising, almost all passengers, except for 4 people, made their way out of the plane on their own. No wonder this accident was nicknamed the Miracle. The aircraft, though, wasn't as lucky. The 9-month-old plane was damaged so badly that it was an immediate write-off. Everyone praised the actions of the flight crew. The landing was incredibly skilled, especially in such a fast-developing, very dangerous situation. The captain himself admitted that few pilots were ever forced to put to the test the skills they got during training, at least not to this degree. He said he was proud of his crew and relieved that everyone had survived, and he never returned to piloting commercial planes.
You unbuckle your seatbelt and stand up, stretching your legs after a long flight. You head towards the restroom and think about freshening up. Suddenly, you're in the air. Luggage flies around you. It feels like the world is ending. You're 30,000 feet above the ground, and you're heading for a crash landing. Before you have any more time to think, everything goes black. In early 2001, a massive Boeing 747 carrying over 400 people took off from Tokyo Haneda International Airport. The flight progressed like normal until it reached 39,000 feet and coasting speed. Food was being served, and passengers were up and about like they would be on any other journey. Slightly earlier in the day, a Japanese airline flight between Busan, South Korea, and Tokyo, Japan, had begun in a similar fashion. This one was smaller, with about 250 people on board. It had also started coasting at around 37,000 feet. Both of these planes were on a similar flight path, only 2,000 feet apart, and due to meet over the Japanese island of Honshu. They were both close to this intersection when the pilot of the Boeing 747 noticed his anti-collision indicator going off. This was when he first knew something was wrong. One of the critical aspects of modern air travel is the coordination of air traffic control. every flight is monitored, and pilots are advised if anything goes wrong. The entire point of air traffic control is to organize flights so well that collisions are impossible. Every modern plane is built with collision monitors, but they are never supposed to be used because of this. While the anti-collision indicators buzzed, 26-year-old trainee Hideki Hachitani was sitting behind the radars at the control tower, monitoring both flights. The stress of having to oversee more than 10 planes was overwhelming him. This isn't surprising, given that he wasn't even certified to operate by himself without supervision. When he noticed the potential collision, he rushed to prevent a disaster. He quickly contacted the flight from Busan that was cruising at 37,000 feet and told them to dip lower, trying to create a bigger gap between the planes. In his rush, though, Hachitani had made a terrible mistake. He had contacted the wrong plane. Instead of telling the Boeing 747 to reduce its altitude, the pilot of the other plane followed Hachitani's instructions and lowered from 39,000 feet to 37,000 feet, the exact same height as the 747. Both planes sped toward each other at 500 miles per hour on a collision course. Hachitani was beginning to panic now. When he noticed that the flight from Busan hadn't descended, he quickly instructed it to turn right. The pilot had, of course, failed to follow the instructions given because they'd been sent to the wrong plane. For an unknown reason, the instruction to turn right failed to reach anyone at all this time. The communications from air traffic control were failing, and the pilots didn't have any idea of how much danger they were in. When seeing Hachitani panicking behind the control panel, his supervisor rushed to the scene and took control of the situation. She contacted the flight from Busan and now told it to climb up. Amazingly, when she did this, she gave the order to a flight that wasn't even operating that day. Both of the flights ignored her because they didn't know that the message was intended for them. The Boeing pilot was at least aware that there was another plane close by, but his faith in air traffic control would have comforted him. Surely, if anything was badly wrong, someone would send him more instructions? At this point, the crash was beginning to look inevitable. For the passengers on the flights, though, everything would have seemed to be normal. They might have been eating some snacks, stretching their legs, or maybe waiting in line for the toilet, completely unaware that they were on course to fly straight into another plane. Luckily for all of the 600-plus people involved, the pilot was well-trained and confident in a situation that would cause most people to freeze up. Through his windscreen, he saw something that no pilot should ever see: another plane heading directly for him. With cat-like reflexes and remarkable composure, the Boeing pilot gripped the throttle and steered the plane down as low as he could for the seconds he had before the collision. The Boeing flew straight underneath the other flight. Imagine being a pilot and seeing the ground in front of you instead of the sky. They both made it out intact. This man had saved the lives of more than 600 people. That isn't to say that everyone got out without a scratch. The passengers were completely unaware of the entire incident, so barely any were buckled in. They were powerless as the change in direction threw them against the inside of the plane. Out of nowhere, with the plane's sudden movement, many hit the roof with the force of a car crash. Every unsecured object and person were thrown through the air. Some might have even felt like the plane had just hit the ground. Miraculously, only 7 passengers and 2 crew members were seriously injured, and the rest only received minor injuries. The pilot circled back to Tokyo to allow all of the injuries to be treated. Thanks to the quick response of medical teams and unbelievable decision-making and skill shown by the pilot, everyone on the flight survived. Every time you travel on a plane, you're signing up to shoot through the sky at speeds of up to 500 miles per hour in a fragile metal shell. You're surrounded by enormous, dangerous motors, 6 or 7 miles above the ground. Surely there's no way you'd survive if the plane itself started to fail. The Hudson Bay landing shows that skilled pilots can overcome seemingly insurmountable odds. On January 15, 2009, Flight 1549 was set to fly from New York to North Carolina. The pilot, Chesley Sullenberger, was a former jet pilot who converted to commercial flights in the 1980s. The sky was clear and the conditions were favorable. It was a typical flight for all of the 155 passengers on board, until the worst happened just a minute and a half in. As the plane climbed to 3,000 feet, they hit a flock of Canada geese. They hit the entire plane, but most importantly, some geese got caught in both engines. When Sullenberger realized that his engines were failing, he contacted air traffic control. They ordered him to land back at the airport, but he realized that it was impossible. With failing engines and no clear runway to land on, he had to take control of the situation to save the lives of everyone on board. Without full control of his plane, he wasn't able to operate at the normal altitude. He flew so low that he passed over the George Washington Bridge at only 900 feet. The people on the bridge were terrified to see the plane so close, but they had no idea how bad things were on board. With the plane speeding at 140 miles per hour, Sullenberger saw the Hudson River in front of him, and he had no choice but to land on it. Everyone in the control tower was shocked to hear what he had to do, but there was no other option. Landing on a runway is one thing, but commercial pilots aren't trained to land in a river. Sullenberger had to think clearly and plan the landing while flying towards the ground. He made sure to allow the tail to touch the water before the nose. Landing nose first would compromise the engines further and cause even more damage. Amazingly, the plane touched down on the water without falling apart. Their momentum gradually decreased until they were at a slow, steady pace across the surface. From a distance, people might have thought it was just a slow-moving boat. A ferry arrived impressively quickly to fetch the stranded passengers, who waited on the wings and the inflatable slides. Everyone received minor injuries from the collision with the river, but they all survived. Captain Sullenberger went down in history as one of the most remarkable pilots ever, having saved so many people from a seemingly hopeless situation. There was even a movie made about his heroics. February 2nd, 1970. We're at an Air Force base in Montana. Today, the 71st Fighter Interceptor Squadron plans to hold a training sortie. 4 pilots get into jet planes and take off. Shortly, one of the pilots accidentally activates the braking parachute. A fabric dome shoots out of the plane. It's filled with air and interrupts the flight of the aircraft. The pilot has to land. The other 3 pilots continue the training. They arrive at the designated place and begin to simulate an air fight. Every pilot is a professional in his field. They have undergone similar training many times. But something amazing is going to happen today. The pilot of one plane, Major Curtis, must fight with 2 other planes. One of the Major's opponents is Captain Faust. 2 planes are chasing the target. Major Curtis turns his jet and directs it straight upwards. The other 2 planes follow suit. The Major performs a maneuver, vertical rolling scissors. He flies up in a spiral while simultaneously making a barrel roll. Then he turns around and flies down, performing a dive. The pursuers are not far behind. Major Curtis makes another aerial maneuver. He goes to the side and flies past Captain Faust. At this moment, the captain's plane begins to shake. Its front part lowers and the jet hurtles to the ground at great speed. Captain Faust can't do anything. The plane doesn't listen to him. The control stick doesn't work. The engine's breaking down. The captain activates the braking parachute, but that doesn't work either. The plane is getting closer and closer to the ground. It can no longer be saved. Now it's important to save at least Captain Faust's life. He ejects and opens the parachute. Suddenly, the abandoned plane starts to fly straight. The flaps on the wings are activated, and it stops falling down. The plane without a pilot flies and slowly descends. It goes at a speed of 200 miles per hour and disappears from sight behind the cliffs. Captain Faust lands safely on a snow-covered field. The other pilots see this and are afraid the plane will fall in a nearby town. They immediately head in that direction. At the time, the unguided aircraft descends, touches the ground, and slides along the field. Next, it makes a 20-degree turn and breaks through a small fence. The plane stops at a farmer's field. The owner of the farm calls the local sheriff. The sheriff arrives and calls the nearest military base to report what happened. He approaches the fallen plane to assess the damage and turn off the humming engine. But as soon as he gets closer, the plane begins to hum and shake as if it wants to escape from there. The plane owners arrive. They are surprised because the plane is in almost perfect condition. They deliver it back to the base, repair it, and return it to service. In 2016 in Belgium, a train was traveling without a driver. That day, people at 2 railway stations saw a train slowly moving between them. It didn't make any stops, brake, or accelerate. It was just slowly riding onwards. Passengers couldn't contact the driver and get out of the vehicle because no one was controlling the train at the time. Panic was rising. People began to say that a ghost train without a driver appeared. But the truth turned out to be not so mysterious. The empty passenger train had been leaving the station according to the schedule when the driver noticed some kind of malfunction. He stopped the train and got out of the cabin to see what happened. But for some reason, the train started again by itself, and the driver didn't have time to jump on it. Fortunately, everything ended well. The driver warned all his colleagues about the runaway train. Everyone was evacuated from the train stations. Then, at some station, one brave driver jumped into the cabin right on the move and stopped the stray train. Speaking of ghost trains, you can see such things in the UK. They pass through railway stations that have long been abandoned. If you get on such a train, you'll probably be the only passenger. Authorities let these trains drive because it's economically profitable for the country. To cancel the route of a ghost train, you need to go through a lot of bureaucratic procedures and spend tons of extra money. So, they travel all over the country and don't bother anyone. Now we go to the ocean to learn about the ship that was drifting for several months without its captain. The ship's called Alta. It was bought by a new owner in 2017 and marked with the flag of Tanzania. Almost all cargo ships are equipped with AIS, Automatic Identification System. That's a navigation system that works on the principle of GPS. All vessels are equipped with AIS, so their movement in the ocean can be tracked. This feature was disabled for the Alta. The ship disappeared from the satellite's eyes and reappeared several times. In 2017, it sailed by Greek port cities. The Alta made 12 stops in 3 such towns in different parts of Greece. Then the AIS signal disappeared. 10 months later, the Alta appeared again on the northern coast of Africa. In September 2018, it was headed to Haiti. During this trip, the ship's engine failed. The nearest shore was far away. The ship began to drift. A few days passed. The crew couldn't repair the vessel. The food supply was almost out. The situation was getting worse as a strong hurricane was approaching the place where the ship broke down. Fortunately, a rescue boat came to the sailors. They were all evacuated shortly before the hurricane hit. The Alta stayed drifting in the ocean. After a while, another ship came to tow it to the coast of Guyana. But something went wrong. Somebody stole the Alta. It's unknown who did it and why. Then, almost 1 year passed. In the waters of the Atlantic Ocean, a British Navy ship notices the drifting Alta. There's no one on board. No one controls it. Then, almost 6 months later, a resident of a small town in Ireland sees the abandoned ship off the coast. Somehow, the Alta was able to cover the distance across the Atlantic and wash up on the coast of Ireland. The Irish authorities said it had been a miracle that no one else saw the ship. It sailed calmly for such a long distance, surviving storms. They started an investigation to establish the owner of the vessel. It's important to find a responsible person who will tow off the Alta. It's extremely difficult to do so, though. They didn't find the owner. One day, an unknown person called the Irish authorities and introduced themselves as the proprietor of the Alta, but didn't provide any evidence. But the record for the longest drifting vessel along the ocean belongs to the SS Bechimo. People were seeing this ghost ship at different times for 38 years. It was a merchant ship owned by a Canadian trading company. In 1931, the ship got blocked by ice off the coast of Alaska. A strong snowstorm began. The crew waited a week for the bad weather to end, but the storm only intensified. One day, when the storm subsided a bit, part of the crew went to the nearest town. The rest of the crew members and the captain set up camp near the vessel. The storm didn't stop for a long time. The blizzard was so strong that people couldn't see beyond their stretched hands. Finally, when the storm was over, the captain went to find the ship. And couldn't. He decided it sank during the snowfall. A week later, the ship was found, drifting near the place where it was lost. Its hull was damaged so badly that it was unsafe to sail on it. The captain decided to abandon the vessel. However, it didn't sink. For the next 38 years, it was seen drifting at various points along the coast of Alaska. The last time people saw the frozen ship stuck in the ice was in 1969. In 2006, a special project was created to find SS Bechimo. However, in all these years, they've found nothing. Its fate is still unknown. It's likely the ship found peace on the seabed of the Chukchi Sea.
A plane with no identification marks is approaching the coast of Indonesia. It's not the most peaceful of times, and the flight operator is alarmed. 2 fighter jets take to the sky, about to take down the unidentified plane. It's all about to end in a disaster, when the fighters notice one strange detail. December 1st, 1941. Captain of a Boeing 314, Robert Ford and his team are preparing for one of the longest flights on one of the biggest planes in the world. The Boeing 314 Clipper California is a high-capacity seaplane. It has no landing gear, so it can only land on water. Its length is 100 feet, and its wingspan is 150 feet. This is more than a 6-story building, and on board this plane, there is a restaurant, resting areas, and even a room with a bed. Despite its size, the Clipper California can stay in the air for more than 18 hours. Captain Ford doesn't suspect what is awaiting him ahead. He gets on the plane. Their flight is bound from San Francisco to Auckland, New Zealand. The first stop is Los Angeles. There's no problem with this. The next stop is Pearl Harbor. The flight is going fine. December 7th, 1941. It's been 3 days since the plane left Pearl Harbor. The last final step of the journey remains: flight to New Zealand. At this moment, Captain Ford receives an order to return the plane to the nearest Allied base. The way back is closed, so the plane continues to fly to Auckland. The Clipper lands safely at the Auckland airport and receives an order that seems impossible. Robert Ford and his team must paint over all the registration and identification marks on the plane and deliver it to LaGuardia, New York. Then, fly across the world. This is an uncharted route with a length of 23,000 miles. In the entire history of aviation at this time, no one has flown such a distance. The team doesn't have maps or modern navigation devices. They don't know the lands they will fly over. They don't know who they may meet on their way and at which airports they will land. They must maintain and repair the plane themselves, extract fuel, and plot the route. At the same time, they have almost no money. Immediately after receiving the order, the team goes to the Auckland Library. They study all the atlases and maps to create a detailed flight plan. First, they need to get to Australia, then fly to Africa along the coast of Asia, and then they should go to the US. The crew paint all over the signs on the plane and prepare for takeoff. Fortunately, before the start, one banker finds about their situation and gives them $500. The plane takes off. The team didn't notice they forgot to paint over the American flag. In a few days, it will save their lives. Before Australia, they fly to New Caledonia to evacuate a group of people from there and deliver them to Australia. The operation is successful. In Australia, the team needs to refuel the plane. They don't find special transport for Clipper services at that airport, so the crew themselves transport 800 cans of gasoline. And here's an important detail. The Boeing 314 doesn't use conventional fuel. It needs to be filled with special high-octane aviation gasoline. Early in the morning, the Clipper takes off and heads to Indonesia. The flight is going fine. They are approaching the airport. Meanwhile, the captain of the base where the Clipper is supposed to land notices an unidentified plane. He doesn't know who's flying it and from where. No one warned him about it. It may be an enemy plane. 2 fighter jets take to the sky. They are approaching the Clipper and don't see any identification marks on its body. The pilots are about to attack, but at that moment, they notice an American flag. If Robert Ford hadn't forgotten to paint it over, then everything would have ended badly for him and his crew. The fighters allow landing. The Clipper lands on the water. A boat floats towards it to meet the plane's crew, but stops. It turns out the plane landed on a place filled with sea mines, so the boat doesn't dare to sail there. The Clipper approaches the port and miraculously avoids contact with mines. Robert Ford and the crew of the plane are well met. They are going too quickly to rest and hit the road. But then, a big problem surfaces. The plane is running out of fuel, and at that naval base, there is only ordinary automobile gas. Nobody knows if the plane engine is going to go with it. It may burn out or stop working altogether, but there's no choice. They fill the tanks with ordinary fuel. Captain decides to take off using the remnants of aviation fuel, and during the flight, they switch to tanks with ordinary gasoline. When this happens, the plane's engine begins to clap and rattle, but after a while, it calms down. The flight continues. For 19 hours, they fly on dangerous fuel. Their next stop is Ceylon. The sky is covered with clouds. The pilot doesn't see the coast in the airport, so he decides to lower the plane below the clouds. They fly at an altitude of 300 feet above the surface of the sea and notice a huge whale ahead. The plane flies closer, and it turns out it's not a whale. It's an enemy ship. The Clipper begins to gain altitude to hide back into the clouds. Finally, they are again surrounded by a white veil. The booms and blasts are heard behind and below the plane. The Clipper's flying with zero visibility for 60 minutes. Finally, the clouds are clearing and they see the port of Ceylon. The team makes a short stopover and proceeds with its journey. As soon as the plane takes off, one of the engines explodes. Fortunately, they didn't have time to fly far from the port, so they successfully landed the plane on the water and repaired the engine. The Clipper continues its mission. Now, Robert Ford's team flies mainly over land. This is very risky, since the aircraft doesn't have landing gear and it can't safely land on solid ground. Finally, they get to the Congo. The team has a great time here, gains strength, rests, and most importantly, gets high-octane aviation gasoline. Things are going great, but there's another ordeal ahead. Now, the aviators will have to make the longest flight in their journey. Their next stop is a port town in Brazil, and the distance to it is 3,500 miles across the ocean. The maximum flight distance of the Boeing is 3,700 miles. Any deviation from the course or a strong headwind can easily prevent the aircraft from reaching the port. Worried, the crew refill the tank and load additional fuel onto the plane. They leave the Congo, taking off along the narrow river. At this moment, the pilot notices the river ends a few miles away with a waterfall. The plane must urgently gain altitude, but it can't. The large amount of additional fuel bears the Clipper down. The waterfall is getting closer. In the last seconds, the plane manages to rise to the desired height. But even after the waterfall, Boeing still doesn't get high enough. It hovers right above the rocky coastal cliffs. A slight inclination can lead to a crash. Fortunately, they manage to pass unharmed. The plane rises to the perfect height. During the flight from the Congo to Brazil, the crew broke a new record. It's 23 hours and 35 minutes in the air. The tired crew make a long-awaited landing in the city of Natal. However, the rest doesn't last long. 2 hours later, they take to the air and head to the next stop, an airbase in Panama. January 6, 1942, 5:54 a.m. The already legendary Boeing 314 is approaching LaGuardia, New York. The team can't wait to finish their journey. They contact the dispatch, and he tells them they can't land the plane only after 7 a.m., since the air terminal starts working at this time. For an hour, Robert Ford and his crew are circling in the air. It was probably the longest hour of their lives. Finally, the mission is complete. The Boeing 314 becomes the first passenger plane to make an almost around-the-world trip. This long flight lasted more than a month. This plane spent 209 hours or 8 days in the air. During this time, it covered more than 30,000 miles and made 18 landings.
That little yellow hook you can see from the airplane's window if you're sitting next to the wing is there to help you in case of an emergency landing. Inflatable slides can only be deployed from the emergency exit doors in the front and the tail of the plane. In the middle, the passengers would have to walk right out on the wing and get to the ground from there. But jumping from the plane wing isn't safe because it's just too high. And here's where those little yellow hooks come in handy. The flight attendants tie ropes from the doors and through the loops for the passengers to hold onto. This way, everyone can safely get to the ground without injuries. Now, you want to try to avoid cozying up under airplane blankets. Some airlines only wash them about once a month. Better use your own travel blanket, a scarf, or a jacket. And always remember to wear your shoes while walking around the plane. That carpet on the floor can't and won't be cleaned to perfection between flights. It's just too much time and effort for the cabin crew. The dirtiest place on a plane isn't the bathroom. It's your tray table. It has 8 times more bacteria than an onboard toilet flush button. Now, in case of emergency, oxygen masks only have enough airflow to last for about 15 minutes. Luckily, it's just the amount of time a plane needs to find a suitable landing place or to at least descend to the altitude where people won't need oxygen masks anymore. You may wonder why you're asked to lift your seat back and close your tray table before takeoff and landing, but it's for your own safety. A reclined seat is comfy for you, but it makes it harder for the passenger behind you to get out of their seat, which is crucial in case of an emergency. The lower tray table is the same way, only this time it's you who won't be able to stand up fast enough if anything happens. Besides, the tray table prevents you from assuming the secure position in the event of an emergency landing. This position requires you to bend over in your seat, put your head between your knees, and cover the back of your head with your hands. Imagine doing that while your tray table is open. If you look around the cabin, you'll notice little black or red triangles around the midsection of the plane. These stickers let the flight attendants know where the airplane wings are located so they can immediately look out the right window to see if something is amiss outside. You shouldn't lower the window shades while taking off, taxiing, or landing for 2 reasons. First, the flight attendants must always be able to monitor the situation outside, and open shades help them with that, obviously. Second, if something's gone wrong on board the plane while it's on the ground, for example, a fire, the ground crews won't be able to see it and evaluate the situation before going in unless the windows are open. That tiny hole you see at the bottom of any airplane window isn't there to scare you nuts. In fact, it helps keep the pressure from the inside and the outside of the window equalized. The hole itself is only made in the second layer of glass, and there are 3 of them overall, which also helps with security, by the way. Even if the outer glass breaks, there will still be 2 more to keep you safe. Now, you might see flight attendants touching the overhead compartments while they're walking along the aisle, but that's not exactly what they do. Right beneath the compartments, there's usually a handrail that goes all the way through the cabin, so you can also use this trick to stay firmer on your feet in the aisle. The pilots dim the lights in the cabin during nighttime, not for you to get cozy and sleepy. Our eyes have a hard time adjusting to darkness in the first few minutes of sudden lights out. And in the case of emergency, every second matters. So the lights get dimmed to let you get used to darkness in case something happens and you have to act fast. Pay attention to the aisle floor too. If there's an emergency landing at night, there will be 2 luminescent strips along the aisle showing you the way to the exit. Follow them to get safely out of the plane. Flight attendants also suggest counting the seats between you and the emergency exit once you're seated. This will help you navigate in case there's no other guidance available. If a lightning bolt hits the plane, the passengers won't feel it. The entire aircraft is covered with aluminum coating that conducts electrical current and doesn't let it inside. This protection is tested using a lightning simulator. Airplane windows are round because the air pressure is evenly distributed this way. If the plane's windows were square, strong air currents would accumulate in the corners of the windows, depressurizing the cabin, and that's bad. Don't think you become untouchable if you go to the airplane toilet. The bathroom door can be opened from the outside. There's usually a small latch at the top of the door that allows cabin crew to get you out of there. It's useful for both getting to people doing something suspicious in the bathroom and helping those who don't feel well and, for example, collapsed while in the toilet. Yeah, let's avoid doing that. The plane's wings flash red and green lights at night to show the direction the plane is heading in. A green light is always on the right wing, and a red one is on the left. Aircraft tires are designed to withstand 4 to 5 times more pressure than they actually experience upon landing. The wheel is more likely to break than the tire. Pilots always have different meals. This is necessary to reduce the risk of food poisoning. The flight can still go well if one of the pilots has gone down because of a stale burrito, but not if it's both of them. And try not to both of you eat the fish. Some airlines don't allow pilots to have beards. Facial hair can prevent securely fitting the oxygen mask, and pilots must always remain conscious. The seats are blue in most aircraft because this color soothes people. It's also easy to keep clean. The rumbling noise you hear after boarding the plane is luggage being loaded on the plane. The compartment is right beneath the cabin, so it can sound quite loud sometimes. On most flights longer than 7 or 8 hours, pilots have access to a specially designed rest seat in or near the cockpit. Flight attendants typically have a section of the cabin reserved for them, and it's sometimes separated from the passenger areas. Some larger aircraft even feature private crew quarters above or below the main cabin. The wings of most passenger aircraft are located at the bottom of the plane. It's called a low wing. Firstly, if you install the engine under low wings, it'll be closer to the ground and easier to repair. Secondly, the wings will take on part of the shock in case of a hard landing. And if the plane falls into the water, then the wings become a life-saving pillow. By the way, a plane can stay afloat for 10 minutes to 60 hours. It all depends on the model of the plane, weather conditions, and pilot skills. Now, most airplanes are white because this color best reflects the sun rays and the aircraft body doesn't heat up as much. Also, the damage is best seen on white, and white paint is simply cheaper. Shoulder straps seem more secure than just a waist belt, but not in the case of planes. When the plane gets into turbulence, it's tossed a bit in the air. The waist belt will simply hold you in place in case of a more severe shake. Shoulder straps would require more space between the seats, and this is not justified on a plane. In a car, the impact is usually much stronger, so you need that shoulder strap not to whoosh through the windshield. Flight attendant seats do have passenger straps, but that's because they are much less comfortable than passenger ones. They're narrower and positioned facing the passengers. Flight attendants need extra protection simply not to fall off their seats if the plane shakes hard enough. Also, they have to help and direct people during potential evacuation, and for that, they need to be in top shape. Now maybe you've noticed that you always enter the plane from its left side. Firstly, the captain usually sits on that side. This way, it's easier for the captain to align the plane with the terminal jet bridge. Also, the aircraft is fueled and loaded with the baggage on the right side. If passengers come from the left, the crew can do their job undisturbed.
Let's face it, airports can be pretty annoying, but the most annoying thing about them is probably having to take the laptop out of your backpack and put it in a separate bin while going through the security check. But, of course, they wouldn't make us do those extra moves if there wasn't a good reason for it. Laptops are dense, and X-rays can't penetrate them, so it's easy to hide something dangerous there. If the device is out and on its own in a separate bin, it's easier for the scanners to capture something dangerous. Most airplanes are white. Is there a benefit to choosing this exact color? No, white paint doesn't make a place feel lighter. Neither does it save money on painting. Here are the actual reasons for the choice: safety, efficiency, and comfort. The first airplanes had a metallic color, but the problem with metal is that it's prone to corrosion. so painting it is a great way to protect an airplane from corrosion. White is favored for several reasons. First, planes fly high above the clouds and are exposed to sunlight a lot. White is the color that absorbs the least heat, and white planes get heated less. Also, sunlight makes the paint fade away. A colorful airplane will have its paint fade very fast and will require repainting. And repainting is costly, so painting aircraft white is a more lasting choice. Also, any damage is more easily noticed on a white surface. So that's one more point for the white color. We always board from the left side of the plane, every single time, no exceptions. For some reason, the right side just doesn't seem to be an option. Yes, that's done on purpose. First, the captain usually sits on the left. This way, it's easier for the pilot to align the plane with the terminal jet bridge. Also, aircraft are fueled and loaded with baggage on the right side. Since people board the plane from the left, the crew can do their job undisturbed, and there's no danger to passengers. Consistency with the choice of a side helps to make everything work more effectively. Since everyone always enters from the left, all jet bridges are designed to get attached to the left side of the airplane. If every airplane had the freedom to choose the side, it would create an additional mess for the logistics behind the process. There are more questions popping up, like what does this black triangle drawn above one of the windows mean? Apparently, it marks the seat from which the view of the airplane's wing is the best. It's needed for the crew to find the spot as fast as possible if, in case of an emergency, they need to inspect the engines, slats, or flaps. This mark saves a lot of time. Next, the rows aren't well aligned with the windows. This is business. Originally, all planes are designed with rows and windows lining up perfectly. But when an airline buys a jet, they add some additional seats, squeezing them closer together. This way, they have more seats, which means more passengers, so they can sell more tickets. But you get less space for your legs and might miss out on a window. Also, all windows have rounded corners, and this is done for safety reasons. There used to be planes with squared windows, but those caused crashes because such windows couldn't withstand high-altitude pressures. At high altitudes, external atmospheric pressure is lower than the pressure inside the cabin. So, there's a big difference in pressure inside and outside the airplane, and this creates stress. Without windows, this stress flows smoothly through the material. A squared window becomes an obstacle, and the flow of stress needs to change direction. The pressure builds up in the corners, leading to cracks. As a result, such windows break. Oval windows allow the stress to flow more smoothly without disrupting them too much and preventing stress concentration. So, oval windows are safer. The glass used in production is stretched acrylic glass, and there are 3 separate panes of it. This is done as a security measure in case there is a breach. This way, at least one pane will remain intact at all times. Have you ever noticed those small holes in the windows? The tiny hole is actually only in the pane that's in the middle. Its task is to regulate the huge pressure difference inside and outside the cabin. This way, the outer pane can handle the load. If the outer pane breaks, the middle one, even though there's a hole in it, will be able to keep the window intact. Also, that hole prevents the windows from fogging up. Now, let's say you want to relax and watch a movie. Luckily, there's a pair of headphones. But they're weird. They have a 2-pronged plug. No, this is not some kind of advanced technology. This is a witty move to prevent theft. If you can't use them anywhere else but on the airplane, no one will have the urge to snatch them away. Outside the airplane, they're basically useless. And then, they bring food. There are people who love airplane food and people who aren't very fond of it. But most will agree that food does taste different in the air. Turns out, it's actually a thing. Low air pressure, lack of humidity, and background noise that we have at high altitudes change the functioning of our taste buds. They become less sensitive to sweet and salty foods, so airlines have to use more seasoning. Have you ever wondered what would happen if someone opened an airplane door accidentally? This wouldn't end well. It would be very dangerous to say the least. More specifically, soon there would be a lack of oxygen in the cabin. But gladly, no one can open that door accidentally. The pressure difference between inside and outside makes it almost impossible. It would take some immense strength to open it. The doors are designed to open on their own in case of an emergency. Speaking of safety, during takeoff and landing, the crew dims the light in the cabin. This is done for a good reason. This way, in case of emergency, you will see everything more clearly. Your eyes will get used to the darkness, and you'll have an easier time evacuating. Now, about pilots. They always wear those cool sunglasses, but the purpose is not to look cooler. They're used to protect the eyes. Throughout their career, pilots have to take care of their vision, but the problem is that it's not an easy task when you're a pilot. The damaging solar radiation that our sun emits is filtered out by the Earth's atmosphere, so the sunlight isn't very damaging to you if you spend most of your time on the ground. But it's different up in the sky. There's less air there, and the brightness is way higher. And with every 1,000 feet of elevation, the solar radiation is around 5% stronger. On average, aircraft fly at an altitude of 35,000 feet. This means that the amount of UV radiation is 175% greater than on the ground. This is very damaging to any person's vision. The large amount of time pilots spend in the air makes them vulnerable to different eye problems. And having eye problems can cost a pilot their career. So, wearing sunglasses is a crucial thing for them, and these sunglasses must be of the best quality. They should minimize the impact of sunlight and withstand UV rays, providing 100% protection for the eyes. Also, they can't be polarized, since polarization can mess with the perception of the cockpit displays. They should provide the best clarity, decrease eye fatigue, and minimize color deformation, so that pilots can see just like they would without their sunglasses on.
They make plane wings smooth to let air flow easily around their surface and reduce resistance during the flight. So why did they add these convex yellow hooks? They obviously worsen the aerodynamics. Yeah, they do, but they're also necessary for your safety. Imagine a plane making an emergency landing in the open sea. Everything's going well. The aircraft is sliding on the water. Then rescue boats sail to this place to evacuate the passengers. They leave the plane through emergency exits located above the wings. Before the door opens, the escape slide inflates. Passengers need to walk on the wing and go down the slide, but the wing surface is slippery because of water. They might fall and get hurt. To prevent this, the stewards install a rescue rope. They attach one end to the door and the other to the edge of the wing, passing it through these hooks. During the evacuation, people hold on to this cable like a railing and don't fall. They can also attach rescue boats to the wing with a rope and these hooks, so the sea won't take people far away from the plane. By the way, the plane can stay on the water for 10 minutes to 60 hours, depending on the model, weather conditions, and the pilot's skills. Both the main and emergency exits have extra handles for crew members. During an evacuation, people may panic and accidentally push the flight attendants off their feet. To avoid a fall, they hold onto these handles. A seat belt on an airplane has a slightly different purpose from that in your car. The one in the vehicle protects you from a horizontal hit. When a plane is going through turbulence, it's shaking up and down. Your waist belt keeps you from hitting the ceiling. Crew members have handcuffs for problem passengers. If someone behaves badly and interferes with the flight attendants have the right to chain them to their seats. To do this, they use police handcuffs or plastic ties. This is the maximum that can be done during the flight. Then they report a rowdy person to the airport and hand them over to the police after landing. During an emergency, oxygen masks drop automatically. They have an extra purpose you might not know about: to equalize the pressure and prevent panic. Air pressure can change because of turbulence. So, among other things, the masks help passengers stay calm. Your seat is your safe haven. That life jacket under it won't let you drown. Also, the seat's surface is made of waterproof material. If water gets into the cabin, the seat will save you from freezing, since it won't get wet. It's also fireproof. The cover can prevent the fire from spreading through the cabin. But more importantly, it can save you from the flames. Of course, you'll most likely never have to use this feature, but it's nice to feel safe, isn't it? You can use the tray table in the seat in front of you like a hammock. Just tie a belt, a blanket, or a towel around the table and stretch your feet out. You might have noticed black triangles on the wall above the seats. For you, as a passenger, they may indicate the seats that have the best view of the wings, where you can take the most beautiful flight photos. But the triangles weren't created for your camera. The crew members monitor the condition of the aircraft through windows under these signs. Suppose the wings freeze, the engine catches fire, or the pilot receives a signal about some problem. In that case, the crew will quickly move to the triangles and assess the situation. And there you are, sitting under the triangle, looking at the wing and thinking, why are the wings located in the lower part of the plane? They could install them above the windows or right in the center. Actually, some planes have them in the middle and higher up, and each location makes sense. The engine and turbines are under the wings. It's much easier to repair them since they're close to the ground. And in case of an emergency landing in the sea, the wings act as a rescue cushion. They help to keep the plane on the water. Empty fuel tanks under the wing can also help the plane stay on the surface. But this position has certain risks. Debris can get into the turbines on the runway. Fortunately, this is unlikely to happen since they carefully clean it. Planes with wings in the middle get the least air resistance. That's why they build fighter jets and supersonic aircraft this way. Big cargo planes have wings in the upper part of the hull. Thanks to it, the aircraft stays close to the ground. It makes it easier to load cargo. Also, it's safer to land on unprepared runways with high wings, since debris won't get into the turbines. The aerodynamics of these planes works better thanks to such wings. They get less air resistance and deliver cargo faster. Oxygen inside the masks is a combination of chemicals. The transportation of oxygen tanks is too expensive for the airline. They take up a lot of space and increase weight, which leads to extra fuel consumption. Therefore, they use a chemical oxygen generator. It's located in the panel above your head. There's a small tank with barium, sodium, and potassium compounds. They mix and create a hot chemical reaction that releases oxygen and passes it into the mask. Small holes in windows save the glass from breaking. The air pressure inside the aircraft is much stronger than that outside. The difference is so big that the air can just break the glass from the other side. To prevent this, they drill small holes. The air penetrates there and reduces the load on the window. By the way, they have a round shape for the same reason. It's ideal for an equal distribution of air. If they were square or triangular, air streams with moisture would accumulate in the corners. It would lead to destruction. Plus, all water gets dried out thanks to the hole. Windows are made of triple glass. The outer glass takes the pressure. The middle one works like a fuse. The third layer protects the second one from passengers who like to touch it. Technically, the plane could fly with one layer, but it would be dangerous. They also installed extra protection for the wheels. They experience huge loads during landing, but don't worry, they won't burst. The tires can withstand pressure 5 to 7 times bigger than they actually get. See the toilet sign on the door? There's a secret latch under it. Crew members can unlock the door from the outside, so don't expect complete privacy. Of course, it's prohibited for other passengers to do that. The cabin crew can open it in case of emergencies. When flight attendants pass through the cabin during the flight, they always touch the upper shelves above the seats. They don't check if the luggage compartments are closed. Along the bottom of these compartments, there are handles in the form of jagged edges. Flight attendants hold on to them not to fall. It's a pretty convenient thing, especially for those who don't like touching the seats with sitting passengers on the way to the toilet. There's an important reason why they install turbines under the wings. Previously, they put them in the plane's tail to improve the aerodynamics of the flight. If one of the engines stopped working, the cabin wouldn't shake so much. Yes, planes can fly with one turbine running. Also, The wings were thinner and streamlined, thanks to turbines in the tail, which was also good for aerodynamics. But it turned out that such a location meant additional costs. The engine in the tail was inconvenient to maintain. They used to place it high, so people needed special equipment and extra time to service it. And of course, it affected the ticket price. They started to install turbines under the wings to save money and time. Have you ever noticed the flashing light in the cabin before takeoff? This happens when the pilot disconnects a plane from the airport power supply and switches to the onboard one. This rapid transition may cause flashing. Want to catch a glimpse of what flying might look like in the future? Then you're in the right place. Economy class lie-flat bunk beds, vertical flying vehicles, AI-powered in-flight meal service. Buckle up and let's start our flight. But first, I need to ask you, have you ever heard of the Crystal Cabin Awards? Oh, those are like the Oscars of aviation interior design. And here are some of the most recent winners. Meet Skynest, a lie-flat bed for people traveling in economy class. These nests are supposed to be used on long-haul flights. The design is based on a sleep pod island located in the middle of the plane. And you can book a 4-hour time slot if you want to take a real nap during your flight. The best news is that this design is likely to be introduced next year. While traveling in premium economy on long routes, you'll be able to use smarter seating design. It includes wider seats and twin armrests, which means no more fighting for space with your neighbors. Plus, there will be fully flexible rows with cushions that can be elevated, creating lie-flat beds. Lufthansa Group has promised that premium passengers will be able to book suites with double beds and travel on temperature-controllable heated or cooled seats. As you see, these days, airline companies are working hard on new designs of aircraft cabins, and it might impact the entire future of air travel. At the moment, they focus on travelers' experience within the walls of the plane. As a result, we have some mind-boggling products. Check out Singapore Airlines first-class suites, or Air France's La Première cabin, which is believed to become one of the best first-class cabins in the skies. It's going to feature suites equipped with separate sofas and chairs, and each suite will have 5 windows along the cabin wall. This will make it the longest first-class suite in the world. But then, Airbus went and patented the idea of a more interactive flight experience, especially for those lucky passengers occupying window seats. With the help of special eye-tracking equipment, the aircraft might be able to highlight significant objects you're looking at and provide you with detailed information, appearing on a semi-transparent display on the window. The patent also claims that you could send data to devices connected by Bluetooth or Wi-Fi. This way, takeoffs and landings would get much more exciting, and you'd be able to get information about a new country or city. Qatar Airlines, in turn, came up with the idea of Q suites. It looks like this. On the sides, you have individual suites, while the middle part can be transformed. You can choose to have a double suite to travel together with your partner, or you can have some private space, or even move the walls and turn the place into a quad suite that you can use for a meeting. There might also be some improvements in economy class. They're bound to bring more comfort, especially on a long-haul flight. A company called Zodiac Seats filed a patent based on a zigzag configuration of seats. Look at this aisle, which contains 3 and 4 seats, with each of them facing in the opposite direction. This allows for way more shoulder space than regular seating. Plus, passengers have a lot of leg space. Yes, some people might feel a bit uncomfortable having to face their neighbor for more than 8 hours straight, but aren't these space improvements worth it? Now, you might know that moving around the cabin while flight attendants are serving meals and beverages is kind of tricky. Plus, you have to eat at a specific time with everyone else. Or, if you're not feeling hungry, forego the meal altogether. Well, robots might be the solution. One company has suggested using perfectly sized pods that could slide along the rail in the middle of the aisle. delivering drinks and food ordered by passengers. This way, you could get your meal at the most suitable time for you without leaving your seat. This solution is likely to solve the problems with meal service. Even better, it might allow for fewer galleys and large planes. Unfortunately, this idea was filed 60 years ago and hasn't been implemented yet, so maybe it's not as great as it sounds. Another idea connected with in-flight meal service includes using AI. According to its creators, the technology will record what passengers leave on their trays and later use this data to suggest various catering plans on subsequent flights. Now, even though these innovations sound like they're going to make traveling way more comfortable, they're not exactly revolutionary. But look at these innovations: vertical takeoff and landing aircraft. Hyundai Transys's air taxi cabin concept optimizes space and prioritizes your privacy in a shared cabin. If we talk about short flights, there's City Airbus Next Gen. That's an all-electric, vertical takeoff and landing vehicle with 4 seats based on the lift and cruise concept. It can operate within the range of 50 miles and has a cruise speed of 74 miles per hour. Another amazing prospect is passenger aircraft with AI co-pilots, or even pilots. Some experts claim that planes could potentially be flown on a fully automated basis. Not everyone agrees with this idea, though. A skilled pilot is part of a complicated safety system that reduces risks and keeps passengers safe. Pilots have to be navigators, technicians, engineers, and weather experts. On a regular working day, a pilot needs to deal with ground crew, other air crew, cabin crew, air traffic control, and passengers. That's a lot. And don't forget that they need to communicate well, not only in aviation terms, but also on an interpersonal level. Will AI be able to do the same? Time will tell. But let's get back to the boldest ideas about the future of air travel. Some experts think that sometime around 2040, you'll be able to catch a hypersonic plane ride. Lots of people believe that the era of supersonic planes finished in 2003 when the Concorde commercial airplane was decommissioned after decades of being unprofitable. But it seems the situation might change soon. New supersonic aircraft will fly at incredible heights, and their speed is likely to be at least 6 times the speed of any other passenger plane. Traveling from New York to London, in this case, will take less than 2 hours. By comparison, these days, it takes a conventional airplane 8 hours to fly from one of these cities to the other. There is one problem, though. The supersonic plane tickets will cost a lot, and statistically, people tend to prioritize price over speed. So, experts don't think that a lot of people will be eager to pay a few $1,000s to get from London to Sydney in 4 hours. Plus, such planes will need a lot of liquid hydrogen fuel, and at the moment, it's not cheap. By the way, you might not recognize a plane from 2050. These flying machines will keep changing for the next several decades, and the chances are high that, at some moment, windows will start to disappear from airplanes altogether. This way, aircraft will become stronger and better suited for high speeds. Windows make planes heavier, which results in larger fuel consumption. No wonder cargo planes don't have windows. Planes will also become sleeker and will likely be covered with solar panels. There's also a concept of a plane with its cabin made out of transparent polymers. I don't know about you, but I don't think I'd ever board such a plane. Talk about aerophobia. The chances are that in a few decades, we'll see a hypersonic plane with a jet engine that can turn into a rocket, that can fly into space. Liquid oxygen would get injected into the exhaust, turning the engine into a rocket. It would help the aircraft reach enormous speeds, and on the way back, the engine would turn into a regular jet engine once again.
Okay, shocker. Airplanes don't take off with the wind, but actually against it. I'd think that if you take off with the wind, it pushes you forwards and helps you fly faster, but this is wrong. So I did some digging for us. We should think of an airplane as a kind of kite. To make a kite fly, you launch it against the wind, and so it flies. Here's how it works. There are 4 forces of flight: lift, weight, thrust, and drag. The lifting force is generated because of the differences above and below the kite. Above the kite, the speed of air is higher than below it. So, the pressure below is higher than that of the pressure above, and the kite is pushed forwards. This is the lifting force. There's also an opposing force, the force generated by gravitation that pushes the object down. That one is called weight. The thrust is the force that pushes the object forward. In the case of a kite, it's generated by the string, the wind, and the forward motion you're making. In the case of an airplane, the thrust force is generated by the engines. Finally, drag is the opposing force of thrust. So, to launch a kite into the air, the lifting force must be greater than that of the force of weight. Then, to stay in the air, all 4 must stay in balance. Lift must be equal to weight, thrust must be equal to drag. The moment the plane takes off, going against the wind helps to generate the needed lifting force faster. Yes, going against the wind does decrease the ground speed of an aircraft, but that's not the speed we need. An airplane flies due to the speed of air flowing over the wings. This airflow isn't generated by the plane's engines, but by the wind. And the higher the airflow, the higher the lift. Going against the wind increases the flow of air over the aircraft's wings, giving it an additional lift and allowing it to achieve a higher altitude in less time, because it takes off at a greater angle. The same works for landing. Landing against the wind lets a pilot to descend at a shorter distance in a shorter time. The airflow and the lifting force are the things that are responsible for turbulence. The direction and speed of the wind, and therefore the airflow, isn't constant over time. Sometimes it changes pretty quickly, like 100 times per second. So one moment there's more lift, and the other moment there's less lift, and then the plane is shaking. This is called the turbulence zone. It's not dangerous at all, it just means that you fly through the zone of a highly constant wind, and that's all. So if a pilot is given the option of how to take off, they'd pick to take off into the wind. It's not always the case, and it's not a problem taking off with the wind, but going into it helps a lot. Many airports are designed so that most runways are taking the direction opposing the most typical wind direction of the area. Also, taking off and landing are the most dangerous stages of any flight. That's because the pilot has less time and space to react to any occurring problems. In the air, even if both engines stopped working, a plane won't just start falling. Instead, it'll start gliding through the sky, losing about 1 mile of altitude for every 10 of them going forward. So, the pilot will have about 8 minutes to react and find a safe place to land. During takeoff and landing, the time is limited. If an engine fails, the pilot will have seconds to decide if they should still take off and deal with the problems in the air or cancel the flight. The thing is that canceling isn't even always possible, even if something happens. If the plane has already reached a speed of 100 miles per hour, it can't possibly be stopped before the runway ends. Physics. And getting out of the runway isn't good. Flying is costly, so not only the passengers, but the airline as well wants to make the flight as fast and short as possible. So there's no surprise here, there's always the most efficient way to go from point A to point B. And the shortest way is, of course, a straight line. Now look at some aircraft routes. These don't exactly look straight, but don't let this trick you. We have to keep in mind that the Earth isn't flat like we see on a map, it's a sphere. So these lines only appear like arcs when we project them on a map. In reality, they're pretty much straight. If there's an efficient way, this means that every airline and every plane wants to fly this way. But there are hundreds of planes going from North America to Europe every day, and many go at the same time. Turns out, the air highway is pretty busy. So how come the planes never collide? That's because before a flight starts, the crew make a strict flight plan that is uploaded to the aircraft's computer, and that pilot will have to follow. To be completely honest, there are several of them, just to have options if something goes wrong. What helps to avoid any colliding is that the airspace is three-dimensional, and the planes don't only fly in several lines as cars, but also at different altitudes. Air traffic is managed by dispatchers who watch for planes and control that they don't get closer to each other than 3 miles. There's also flight level regulations. All the westbound flights fly at even-numbered altitudes, like for example 34,000 feet or 36,000 feet. And all eastbound flights fly at odd-number altitudes, like 35,000 feet and 37,000 feet. This means that there's a couple of thousand feet between the planes flying in the same direction. To share the sky safely, each aircraft has to follow their own airway that even has a specific name. There are also some parts of the air that are especially busy, having remarkably high traffic because many planes fly there every minute. So, whenever an aircraft enters a busy zone, it has to stick to a very specific route. So, usually, commercial aircrafts fly on the altitude between 31,000 and 38,000 feet. This altitude is reached within the first 10 minutes of the flight. So, why so high? With height, the air gets thinner, so the plane faces less resistance and can fly faster and burn less fuel. Another reason that they fly so high is that the plane avoids most of the weather patterns that usually happen way lower. High winds and rain happen in the troposphere, the atmospheric layer that is closest to the ground. Planes fly just a little bit above, but already in the next layer, the stratosphere. Since most of the weather phenomena are avoided, the flight is smoother and there's less turbulence. But then, why don't they fly even higher? Remember the force of weight that pushes the object down. An aircraft is very heavy, and the more you weigh, the harder it is to get higher, because the force is stronger. To push it even higher, more fuel will be needed, and that's inefficient. Also, the oxygen becomes too sparse to fuel the engines, so the planes usually fly the most efficient way, high enough to avoid the weather patterns, but not much higher so that they don't spend too much fuel. If you've ever flown, you've probably noticed those little holes on the windows. An airplane window has 3 panes of plexiglass. That tiny hole is only in the one that's in the middle. It exists to regulate the huge pressure difference inside and outside the cabin. This way, the outer plane can handle the load. If the outer pane breaks, the middle one will keep the window intact. Also, that hole also keeps the windows from fogging up. Have you noticed that whenever you enter the plane, you enter it from the left side? It's not random. Firstly, the captain usually sits on the left side of the airplane cabin, so it's easier for the captain to align the plane with the terminal jet bridge from that side. Also, the aircraft is fueled and loaded with the baggage on the right side. With passengers loading the plane from the left side, the crew can do their job undisturbed.
Each airplane carrying over 19 passengers must have a crash axe. You will see it installed as a firefighting device. That way, if there's an electrical fire, crew members can cut away the cockpit or some other panels. The pilots can actually break the windscreen if something bad happens and people need to evacuate. Passenger planes are mostly white to protect them from solar radiation and its effects. Aircrafts need to remain cool at airports in particularly hot countries, while passengers are going in or out. Brilliant white paint can bounce the sunlight back. It also protects some parts of the plane that are made of composite materials, and prevents their damage since there's higher ultraviolet radiation at high altitudes. Commercial planes must get to speeds of at least 155 miles per hour to achieve stability and safety at takeoff. Some smaller planes can sustain altitude even at speeds of 30 miles per hour. But when speeds are that low, the plane can easily get destabilized and could even fail the takeoff. The white trails that planes leave behind, also known as contrails, are created because of water vapor. Vapor is produced during the combustion of fuel in plane engines. When the plane reaches its cruising altitude of 32,800 feet, temperatures get quite low, about -67 degrees Fahrenheit. It's really cold. So, the water turns into particles of ice. How long these particles are going to remain visible mostly depends on humidity. The higher the level of humidity is, the bigger those trails get and remain visible even long after the plane has disappeared. Airplanes all over the globe get struck by lightning almost on a daily basis. A regular airplane in commercial service gets hit on average once a year. How often it happens depends on a couple of things. First, how many landings and takeoffs the plane performs, since lightning mostly strikes at heights between 5,000 and 15,000 feet. It also depends on location. For instance, it's more likely for a plane to get struck by lightning around the equator and in some other parts of the world. Modern planes are designed to withstand such strikes. They have to go through special lightning tests to prove they can cope with strikes. Planes mostly fly at altitudes of up to 7 miles. There are some benefits like the thinner air or producing less aerodynamic drag, which also means less fuel consumption. The temperatures up there are lower, which makes the jet engines more efficient. That part of the atmosphere is also less turbulent, which helps make flights smoother. Some planes have already gone into space, but not the ones you see at the airport. Those classical planes need air to go up, and space is basically just a vacuum. The first plane that reached space was designed around 70 years ago. During its first flight, it generated lift and stability using its thin, stubby wings. It traveled more than 5 times the speed of sound. There are at least 1 sextillion planets out there in our universe. To give you an idea of how huge this number is, our planet weighs almost 1 sextillion times more than some animals, like a bear. None of these planets are cubic, triangular, or any other shape. They're all round. At its beginnings, a planet is just a cloud of dust and rocks that rotates around a central star. Dust and small pieces attract each other because of gravity, and they keep doing it until they form a blob. Now, the blob starts attracting more matter. It grows and gets bigger until it's done with collecting everything in its path. Gravitational forces work equally in all directions, so that blob gets a round shape. But not the perfect one. Our planet, for instance, is almost a sphere, but with a bulge in the middle. The bulge is there because the Earth is spinning. Every time it rotates on its axis, the middle part travels further than the top. The area at the equator is moving quicker than the area at the poles. And the faster you spin something, the more you'll throw it outwards. Sound will travel 4 times faster in water than in air. It's a wave, and that's why it moves faster in a denser substance. Particles that are close to each other, as in denser substances, will bump into each other more easily. Water is denser. There are 800 times more particles in a bottle of water than in the same sized bottle filled with air. Bubbles are round because they occur in a thin film, such as one of soapy water traps air. The molecules in the film attract each other. That way, they stick together and also shape a sphere, because that's the smallest possible area that encloses any given volume. They can't get any smaller because they have trapped air inside. You can turn your pencil into a diamond. If you apply a temperature of 2,550 degrees Fahrenheit and pressure of 55,000 atmospheres, you can transform graphite into diamond. There are actually 2 variations of a single chemical element, carbon. Diamonds aren't just used in jewelry, but for different purposes. For example, as a cutting tool for electronic devices. Beavers are amazing builders capable of creating cool and complex riverside structures. They build them to protect themselves from wild animals that might go after them, like wolves or bears. But not in the way it may look at first. Beavers don't really live in their dams. They only use them as a barrier, making some sort of a pool or pond of deeper water. That's where their real home is, in the pool. It's like a small island or dome lodge. It's a dry area where beavers are safe. They can also store their food there. These pools are deep enough for land animals to avoid them. Beavers dig underwater tunnels that are entrances into their home. If a predator or some other danger is coming, they can quickly escape to safety. Some animals sleep while standing. Zebras, elephants, horses, some birds like flamingos. Cows can sleep while standing, but they prefer to lie down when they want to rest. To sleep while standing, animals need to have legs that can align vertically. That way, they don't have to activate their muscles to keep them standing. Their knees also lock in place. It's better for these animals to sleep while standing because they'd probably be too slow to react if there was a predator going after them. When we laugh in some unpleasant situations, or when we feel nervous, we're actually trying to mask our true emotions. For example, you do something embarrassing and try to cover up the shame you feel. Also, we're more relaxed after laughing, so if you're nervously chuckling in an unpleasant situation, it can help you clear some of your negative emotions. When you buy a bottle of water, you can see it has an expiration date. It's not that the water inside will turn bad. The expiration date is there because the plastic may start to leach into the water over time and contaminate it with chemicals that might be bad for us. The moon has its own time zone. The astronomers created a special watch for all moonwalkers. It measures time in lunations, which is the period of time the moon needs to rotate and revolve around our planet. Each lunation is almost 30,000 Earth days. You can decaffeinate your coffee if you take it into a sauna to moisten the green coffee bean within temperatures of 160 to 210 degrees Fahrenheit. The point is to get 10 milligrams or less of caffeine per one coffee. That's when you can put it in the decaf category. One serving of regular coffee has 50 to 75 milligrams of caffeine. There's a reason the Earth spins. Our solar system formed 4.5 billion years ago. There was a raging cloud of dust and gas. Molecules and atoms in that cloud had a tendency to rotate in a certain direction. That same cloud collapsed under gravitational forces. Gravity magnified its initial rotation and then flattened it out into a disk. Our planet formed within that disk, and now it's spinning because of that old pattern of its parent cloud.
Hello, this is your captain speaking. Welcome aboard today's flight from San Francisco to New York. Fasten your seatbelts, and I'll tell you what's going on inside the plane at different stages of the flight.
Passengers always board from the left side. That's because the captain sits on the left side of the airplane cabin, so it's easier for him to align the plane with the terminal jet bridge from that side. Also, the aircraft is fueled and loaded with baggage on the right side. With passengers boarding from the left side, the crew can do their job undisturbed. If your priority is to get out of the plane as fast as possible once you arrive, pick an aisle seat near the front of the plane. If you want to have the most comfortable flight, pick a seat in the middle of the plane because the turbulence is less noticeable there. An even better option in terms of comfort would be those seats by the emergency exit. They have more legroom and you can stretch. If you want the safest seats on the plane, your best option is the back of it. Once you're seated, take your time to spot the nearest emergency exits. Count the number of rows between your seat and an emergency exit. It can save your life in case you have to leave the plane quickly. You'll manage to find the exit easily, even if everything around is dark or if you're blinded. You'll find it just by touching the seats and passing the number of rows you counted in advance. Boarding completed. Time to get ready for takeoff. Cabin crew are walking down the aisles to make sure all passengers are following their instructions. Okay, everyone has their seatbelts fastened and window blinds open. There's no one in the bathroom and the runway is all clear. Why aren't we still moving? We can go! Turns out, the aircraft must wait for a while. It's all about safety. When a plane takes off, it activates two powerful forces. One is jet wash, a fast-moving gas so strong it can easily flip a car, so no one can be near the plane. Another force is wingtip vortices that are the result of the wind generating the plane lift. These powerful rotating forces go from both wings and stay in the air for about 3 minutes after an aircraft takes off. If another plane flies into the air while the wingtip vortices are still there, the pilot will lose the roll control over the aircraft. The plane will flip over and crash. So, no plane is allowed to take off without waiting for at least 3 minutes after the previous one leaves. Back to the pilot's cabin. There are two people there, the pilot and the co-pilot. In case something happens to the first pilot, the co-pilot can take over. Both pilots eat different food to reduce the risk of them both feeling unwell. While the first pilot controls and adjusts the autopilot, the second one monitors the controls or communicates with the control tower. Also, there are checklists for safety standards to be satisfied at different stages of the route. So, while the captain is focused on the route, the co-pilot can complete the checklist and make sure that everything's going according to the plan. Flying is costly, so not only the passengers, but the airline as well want to make the flight as fast and short as possible. The shortest way is always a straight line. Still, aircraft routes look like an arc. It's because the Earth isn't flat like we see it on a map. It's a sphere. So, these lines only appear like arcs when we project them on a map. In reality, they're pretty much straight. Every airline and every plane wants to fly this most efficient way, but there are hundreds of planes flying every day, often in the same direction, so the air highway is pretty busy. The route data of every plane is pre-planned and is uploaded to the system. There are several of those so that the pilot has options if something goes wrong or if weather conditions change. The pilot can set up the right mode, and autopilot can control the airplane within its uploaded route. Keep up the altitude, speed, and direction. The pilots, meanwhile, keep an eye on the autopilot and focus on other tasks like navigating, planning, and communicating with air traffic control. On the ground, air traffic is managed by dispatchers, who watch over planes and make sure they don't get too close to each other. The air traffic is especially heavy in some places, so when an aircraft enters a busy zone, it has to follow a very specific route. There are also specified points called Fixed Navigational Aids, or, shortly, nav aids. Those are devices on the ground that send radio signals in the sky that an aircraft can pick up on. There are also waypoints, which are geographical points on Earth. They're loaded into the GPS system, and an aircraft has to follow them. So basically, the whole route is flying from one waypoint to another all the way to the destination place. Time to start the descent. You can see the plane's altitude on the control panel. The pilots know the plane's speed, so they can calculate at what distance to destination to start their descent. If the altitude is 27,000 feet and the speed is 300 nautical miles per hour, the first number divided by the second gives us 90 nautical miles. This is the point they have to start the descent to maintain the descent path. There are also a couple of other things to consider, such as the wind speed and direction, or uneven speed drop. To descend, pilots have to get approval from the controller. Sometimes, due to traffic, they don't get it right away. So, they just keep moving forward without descending, therefore shifting away from the descending profile and land when the approval is given. Takeoff and landing are the most crucial and dangerous phases of any flight. That's because the pilot has less time and space to react to any occurring problems. In the air, even if both engines stop working, a plane won't just start falling. Instead, it'll begin to glide through the sky, losing about 1 mile of altitude every 10 of them going forward. So, the pilot will have about 8 minutes to react and find a safe place to land. If an engine fails during takeoff or landing, the pilots will only have seconds to decide if they should still take off and deal with the problem in the air or cancel the flight. Even if something happens, canceling the flight isn't always an option. When the plane reaches the speed of 100 miles per hour, you can't possibly stop it before the runway ends. And getting off the runway isn't good, to say the least. To ensure everyone's safety, the rules at these stages of the flight are especially strict. You should turn on the airplane mode on your devices to make sure that the signals that devices transmit don't interfere with the plane's electronic systems and don't block the radio's frequency. You've probably heard that clicking sound a speaker makes right before your cell phone gets a call, if it's right next to the speaker. These sounds are what the pilot might hear instead of the instructions while communicating with air traffic control. Even a 1-second interference can cause a lot of confusion. Just some certain types of cell phones can cause this problem, and if it's a combination of factors, the cell phone type, how far away it is from the cabin, and how many cell phones aren't in airplane mode. The cabin crew can't find out which of the passengers didn't put their phone into airplane mode, but the pilots will always know when many people didn't do it. You should keep your window blind open during takeoff and landing for safety reasons as well. This way, your eyes get used to the light or the darkness outside. In case of an emergency, during these risky stages of the flight, people who are comfortable with the natural light will react and evacuate faster, which is crucially important when every second matters. For the very same reason, the lights are dimmed in the airplane. This way, the light will be closest to the light outside the aircraft. Another reason is that if the window blinds are open, people from the outside can see what's going on in the plane. For example, they can see if there's a fire inside and where exactly it is. This way, they can plan the evacuation better. They ask you to fold up your table and put up your seat in the upright position to ensure that in case of an emergency, there will be no obstacles in the way. Everyone should be able to leave the plane as fast as possible. The passengers aren't allowed to use the bathroom during takeoff and landing because there's no seatbelt, no safe escape route with no obstacles, and it's not safe overall. A person can get trapped there during evacuation. The pilot isn't even allowed to take off or land while someone is in the bathroom. And looks like we're ready for landing.
Welcome to New York.
When it's too cold outside, airplanes often get delayed, or in extreme cases, even cancelled altogether. First of all, if it snows heavily, such conditions drastically decrease visibility, making it unsafe to taxi and take off. During a blizzard, flight control may command the aircraft to stay on the ground and wait until the snowstorm subsides. Ice on the runway is another reason. An airplane's landing gear are nothing like a car's wheels, and they can't be equipped with studs to avoid skidding. But even if they were, a plane needs to develop speeds on the ground that are much higher than on an average road to take off successfully. If the runway is slippery with ice, the airplane can slide off it easily. Things like this actually happened in the past. For example, in January 2014, the JFK airport in New York was shut down after a plane skidded off the runway and into the snow. Luckily, no one was injured, but the airport staff had to dig the aircraft out of the snow, and even the local police joined the efforts. Same story with landing, which is even trickier in freezing conditions because a plane is in much less of a controlled environment and traveling at even greater speeds. What's more, while an airplane that's about to take off and skidding will probably get into an open area and stop there, one that's about to land could end up crashing into the airport's infrastructure. Needless to say, that's way more dangerous for everyone. Freezing weather conditions can also cause frost and ice sheets to build up on the plane itself. Airplanes are carefully engineered, and any tampering with their structure may cause huge trouble. As experienced pilots say, even a thin crust of ice over the wings of a plane can mess with their delicate design and destroy lift. Planes can be de-iced though. The airport staff usually spray them with a special solution that doesn't let the ice build up on the aircraft's skin. But back to the runway. If it's covered with ice, there's little you can do. Unless the sun is shining, the chances of safely removing the ice from the pavement are almost zero. There's also a chance of damaging the pavement, making potholes, which can result in safety concerns for both takeoff and landing. Imagine driving over a pothole in a car at full speed. Pretty unpleasant. And now multiply it by about 1,000, because a plane is much heavier than a car, and don't forget that the landing gear is not exactly there for driving. Jet fuel and the equipment that pumps it can freeze too if the temperature is too low. The fuel freezes at -40 degrees Fahrenheit, but that can only happen on the ground before takeoff. At a cruising altitude, temperatures may drop as low as -70 degrees Fahrenheit, but since the liquid is inside the plane and burning down steadily, it's much warmer there. On the ground though, nothing stops the fuel from turning into ice. If that happens, no flights are available, obviously. Same goes for the pumping equipment. Even if the fuel is still liquid, the pump may cover with ice and just stop delivering the fuel into the plane's tanks. In the worst case scenario, it might even break down, leading to expensive repairs and prolonged delays in flights. Finally, ground crews have to do a lot of work before takeoff or landing, and they're all human after all, so they can't bear the freezing cold for too long. This issue is often resolved by tag teaming. One group of workers goes out in the field to do the job, while the other is waiting for them in a shelter. After 20 minutes or so, the first group returns to warm up. and the second one takes up the job where the first one left it. Although it's efficient, it still slows down the operations a lot, so that might also cause delays. But despite all the trouble freezing weather can cause, it's actually more beneficial for a plane than extreme heat. Cold air is denser than hot, so planes gain more lift and stay truer while in the air. They're more easily controlled in flight too. Air molecules are slower and closer together, creating a steady flow of air around the wings and cockpit. At high altitudes, the air naturally becomes thinner as the air molecules spread out and become more scarce. That's exactly why planes can't get to the upper layers of the atmosphere. There's just not enough air there to create sufficient lift. The same happens when it's too hot down on the ground though. Air molecules get faster and spread out, meaning the plane's wings don't have as much air to push off and get into the flight mode. To take off in extreme heat, a plane has to move much faster to generate enough air resistance and lift. But to move faster, the plane needs its engines to work better, and that's also impossible when it's too hot. As the air gets thinner, the amount of oxygen decreases too. And jet engines use oxygen in the atmosphere for combustion. When they lack this crucial element, they can't convert enough energy into thrust, meaning slower acceleration and worse energy output overall. So the problem is that the plane has to have a longer runway distance to build up enough speed and lift to take off. But it can't because its engines are not working to the best of their ability. This usually doesn't cause trouble, but only up to a point. When the temperatures on the ground level reaches about 120 degrees Fahrenheit, some flights can get cancelled because it's simply dangerous for them to try and take off. Other planes are more heat resistant and powerful, but that also depends on the heat. Some aircraft even have to reduce their weight by removing part of their fuel, cargo, or even passengers when it's too hot. Lighter load means better acceleration before takeoff, and it doesn't help to avoid cancellations, but it also means planes aren't working to their full capacity. The average cruising altitude for an airplane is about 35,000 feet. They don't technically need to be so high up, but that altitude gives the best speed and efficiency. Air gets thinner at higher altitudes, which means less wind resistance, but less lift. For most commercial aircraft, the area between 30,000 and 40,000 feet is the sweet spot where the two factors balance out. You probably still aren't using a laptop from 1999, and your computer isn't flying at close to the speed of sound. Fortunately, planes have a much longer lifespan than computers. There are airliners from the early 1970s that are still just fine. They might not be able to keep up in terms of speed and fuel efficiency, but older planes are no less safe than their modern counterparts. Contrails, those white trails airplanes leave behind them at high altitudes, are easily mistaken for engine exhaust, but most are nothing more than water vapor. During a flight, moisture in the air collects in the engines before being vented with the exhaust. The hot, wet air leaving the engines mixes with the cool, dry air found at high altitudes, resulting in long, thin lines of vapor. Humidity determines when contrails form and how long they remain visible. Ever notice the numbers on the end of a runway? They're actually used to show the pilot which direction the plane is facing. For example, the number 36 is short for a heading of 360 degrees or due north. Along with numbers, the letters R and L indicate if the nearest runway is to the right or left. The lights on the tips of a plane's wings are called position lights or navigation lights, and they're used during times of reduced visibility. They help planes to see each other in the dark and can also tell pilots what direction an aircraft is traveling. The red light marks the tip of the left wing, while the green light is on the right. The third light is white and found on or near the tail. It might seem odd that the flight crew cares whether your window shades are up or down. The main reason is so that the passenger's eyes can adjust to the outside light. Mostly, it's just a matter of getting people on and off quickly. But in an emergency, the last thing they want is people stopping to blink before they evacuate the plane. The Himalayas have some of the highest peaks in the world, including Mount Everest. But it's no surprise airplanes find it difficult to navigate the area. But why are commercial airplanes actually banned from flying there? For starters, these mountains have an average height of more than 20,000 feet. Mount Everest, the highest mountain in the entire world, stands at 29,037 feet high above sea level. The area is rough, filled with snow, and has almost no flat surfaces. In case of sudden cabin depressurization, it would be really difficult to perform an emergency landing, since there's literally no flat area there. More so, the low oxygen environment at such an altitude means there's likely to be a lot of turbulence. Not only is it really unpleasant for passengers, but random air movements and high wind velocity means that it's really difficult to maneuver the airplane. This area is also quite low populated, so there's not much there in terms of radar systems. And radar is crucial for aviation safety. Without radars, pilots would be unable to communicate with the ground to figure out flight conditions. It can also get so cold up there that jet fuel might completely freeze. Sure, the fuels used in airplanes usually freeze at around -50 degrees Fahrenheit, but it may be possible above Everest. The lowest temperature was recorded there back in December 2004, when thermometers showed a staggering -44 degrees Fahrenheit. So, no wonder pilots don't want to ever take that risk, especially on a commercial flight. Among the few airports located in the Himalayas, there's one considered to be the most challenging to land in the world. Only 8 pilots on the planet are certified to do it. It's called Paro International Airport, and it's located in Bhutan, a landlocked country in the eastern Himalayas. First, landing there is so dangerous because you're literally flying through some of the world's tallest mountain peaks. Not to mention that those 8 pilots also have to consider strong winds. Despite the challenges, they do manage to safely land over 30,000 people each year. Moving further, there's no radar there to guide the pilots, so they need to maneuver the aircraft entirely in manual mode. The pilots need to track their movements based on specific visual landmark checkpoints as they approach the runway. Moreover, flights are only allowed there during daylight hours and under good visibility. These pilots also need to watch out for utility poles and roofs on the hillsides too. It means they often squeeze their planes between mountain peaks at 45-degree angles before dropping quickly onto the runway. No wonder only 2 airlines fly to Paro International Airport. Apart from these commercial pilots, there are specially trained helicopter rescue pilots who spend most of their career at 20,000 feet in the sky. Most of the time, they partner with equally experienced climbers who train by crossing the Khumbu Icefall. It's dubbed the most dangerous square mile on the planet. Made up of ice pillars as tall as a 6-story building, this huge stretch of the glacier on Everest's western side is filled with bottomless ice holes. It takes between 4 to 12 hours to get from one edge of the icefall to the other, depending on the experience of the climber. You may think it's a pretty serene location since you're literally only surrounded by ice and snow, but these local professionals claim otherwise. One Everest veteran said that the noise was actually the worst part of the job. The mountain produces awful squeaking sounds and sometimes even sighs. It often makes people feel like it's talking to them, warning them about the treacherous environment. Mount Everest isn't the only no-fly zone in the world. Surprisingly, Disney parks are also part of this exclusive club. So you won't ever be able to look out of your plane window and see the beauty of fairy tale castles from up above. In recent years, a lot of crowded tourist attractions, including Disney parks, have increased their security measures to make sure their visitors are as safe as possible. As such, no aircraft is allowed to fly within 3,000 feet of Disneyland in California or Walt Disney World in Florida. It was initially a temporary ban, but this rule became permanent back in 2003. Some other places don't have planes flying over them because of their historical importance, like Machu Picchu, located in the Peruvian Andes Mountains. There's also a large number of rare wildlife species and plants that grow exclusively in this area. It's crucial that they're protected as well as possible. What does it have to do with planes not flying over that area? Firstly, it reduces the volume of harmful chemicals in the area. Secondly, if a plane ever needed to perform an emergency landing in this location, it'd cause irreversible damage to buildings and wildlife. Surprisingly, planes can fly over the Greek Parthenon in Athens, but with one condition: not to get closer than 5,000 feet above it. This way, the historical building is kept a bit more protected from any emergency landings, since there are specially designated areas around it. You won't be able to see the Taj Mahal from above either, since it's one of the most important, oldest, and most beautiful pieces of architecture in the world. It also needs added security features. This building dates back to the 1600s. UNESCO announced it a World Heritage Site in 1983. The Indian authorities set up a no-fly zone above it in 2006. They did it to safeguard not only the building itself, but also the crowds of tourists that come there each year, 7 to 8 million people. Buckingham Palace is well known for being the residence of British monarchs. So, for the Queen's security, a no-fly zone was set up here too. Planes aren't allowed to fly over Windsor Castle either, to make sure the royal family is equally protected. Other important British buildings with no-fly zones include Number 10 Downing Street, the British Prime Minister's official residence and office, and the Houses of Parliament. George Washington's home in Mount Vernon, Virginia, can only have planes flying above it at more than 1,500 feet. The historical wooden mansion was built for President George Washington between 1758 and 1778. Unfortunately, the building has seen a lot of damage over the years, so in an effort to preserve it better, authorities decided to prohibit vibrations produced by flying aircraft. That's why another no-fly zone was established there. It covers the airspace above this National Historic Landmark. That's probably the reason why you'll rarely see pictures of this house from above. Since it's the residence of the US President, it's not allowed to fly over Washington, D.C. It's also the home of Congress and other establishments. So, the authorities set a special flight rules area, stretching for 30 miles around Ronald Reagan International Airport. This means that it's one of the airports with the most precise takeoffs and landings. Pilots have to carefully tackle no-fly zones, which sometimes results in uncomfortable takeoffs for passengers. Whenever a pilot breaks a no-fly zone, it's a big problem, like the one that happened back in 2005, when a pilot accidentally steered the plane into a prohibited zone. The capital had to be evacuated immediately, and their regular activities were interrupted. Other capitals of the world have similar requirements, like Budapest, for example. In the capital city of Hungary, planes aren't allowed to fly over the ancient inner city of Pest and the Buda Hills. Almost all air traffic is generally prohibited above Paris too, with some exceptions. Aircrafts flying no lower than 6,500 feet. Flying helicopters are also a big no-no within the city limits. Only certain choppers undertaking precise missions can get special authorization. Generally, passenger planes aren't allowed near the island of Manhattan either, partly because of the really tall buildings there and the added risk of collision, but mostly because all three major New York airports, John F. Kennedy International Airport, Newark Liberty International Airport, and LaGuardia Airport are very close to each other, so the air traffic in the area has to be really well thought out to make sure the planes don't cross paths.